So very generic title to fit in broadly with all of the games and such in this series, games and history, but I'm talking particularly about Assassin's Creed Origins. And so Assassin's Creed Origins and Egyptian history. I am by training an Egyptologist and, well, more broadly, lecturer in ancient history here. And when we were putting, this one a brief tangent, when we were putting this together, Sam asked me for an image and I sent him a bunch of excellent screenshots of the game. So I don't think we can use any of these. How about this one? I was like, fine, put a pyramid in it. But then when I was actually putting the PowerPoint together and I looked more closely, one of the things I saw is, yeah, there's hieroglyphs and they are actually proper hieroglyphs. So this is the Great Pyramid at Giza, which you'll see later in a different part of the paper. But Nesubiti, king of Lower Egypt, Khufu, the name of the pharaoh, Diank, given life. They're actual hieroglyphs embedded into the game. Not all the hieroglyphs are this readable in the game, and I'm not going to comment on whether those with at least elementary knowledge of Egyptian hieroglyphs can read any of the text, because I think that's beyond the point. But did realise that actually some of it is this attention to detail if they are actual Egyptian hieroglyphs. But as at least one person in the room has never played Assassin's Creed Origins, any Assassin's Creed, let alone Origins, I'm assuming probably about half the room hasn't played Origins. So just a couple of very brief, has anyone played Origins? Excellent, one person in the room. So at its very core, Origins is a story about revenge. You play as Bayek, and I realised that most of my screenshots, I don't have his face. I only have him in the Sekhmet helmet, which you get pretty early on in the game, because if you're going to be able to use Sekhmet armour, why wouldn't you use Sekhmet armour? Sekhmet being a lion head goddess, one of the most popular in Egypt. So he doesn't look like that default in the game. But you play, for the most part, as Bayek, an Egyptian Magi from the western desert from Siwa, and sometimes his wife Aya, who's half Greek, half Egyptian. And the story begins with the murder of your son, and it's largely a story of revenge for that, which gets wound up in high-level politics, lots of big bad men involved in the murder, plus Aya is connected with Cleopatra, the seventh, the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty of kings. And the story then intertwines between this personal story of revenge and getting out to kill the priests involved, and high politics in Egypt at the time, date frame 4844 BCE, between Ptolemy XIII, Cleopatra's brother, so power struggles between the two, and ultimately Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. And for those who are not big up on your Roman history, I'm not going to do any spoilers in case you all do go out and play, but it does end on the Ides of March, and for whomever that means something, I'll leave it as that. In the actual game itself, with the big historical events, you actually are a passive participant. You don't get to interject and change history. History happens around you in the big historical events between Ptolemy, Cleopatra, Pompey on his arrival in Egypt, and with Caesar as well. So we have this dual level in the story between what you are involved in. In addition to the game itself, an action RPG, there is a add-on which is free if you have the game. You can also buy it as a standalone. I'm not working for Ubisoft, buy it or don't. However, we would very much like ManMet to get it on Steam to be able to use it in tutorials, potentially, called Discovery Tour. And in this is not a game. This has stripped the narrative, combat. It is an opportunity to explore the entire world that's available in the main game, and they've packaged it into a series of tours covering a range of topics like generically life in Egypt, pyramids specifically, so certain sites, and Roman history. And the tour looks like this when you play it. You go to a place, there's a big golden light, you start, and then you have this trail, this golden light, which you can follow, you cannot do what you want. It does get a bit annoyed at you if you go too far off track. But at certain points, you'll get a pop-up, an image, so as down here in the bottom left, which you can click out and ignore. You don't have to stop everything. But if you do want to it will go into a next screen. I've got a modified version next, as well as a voiceover, which is almost like a museum guided tour, audio guide, giving a little bit of information, not specifically about the object as such, but generically about the topic. This, for example, Egyptian house, I'll get back onto these clay models soon, but this is an example I've pulled up. In the tour Domesticated Animals, there's one which has this image of a mechanical dog. On the right, the Discovery Tour label is just mechanical dog, but it dates it without giving actual calendar dates, but broadly in terms of Egyptian chronological divisions. And it tells you the museum that that item is in now. So it does give metadata about the objects. It's not just here's a pretty picture of a nice object from Egypt. The information is not really specific against generics, so the tour's about pets, it's using dogs, this mechanical dog as a jumping point. This image is actually from the Met catalogue. The one that you actually see pop up is of a high quality. It's absolutely good photographs. In fact, of the museums that they've used, the British Museums contributed, the Louvre in Paris. The Louvre's website is not easy to use or get images. So in fact, some of the images accessible through Discovery Tour are better than the museum's online images. So it actually is this nice balance between it. And so even if, without any inventory numbers or actual museum information, you know it's at the Met, you can go in, just type in mechanical dog Egypt, and the item pops up. The Met has a lot of its, especially Egyptian collection images, online open access to use. So for those who are interested, do a tour like, wow, that's a really nice image of a dog, wherever it is, I want to know more. You can go the next step. It does require you to do the next step. Nothing in the game is going to be linked out. But there is an aspect of this. And this leads to this question, something I'm interested in playing around with at the minute, is how useful is Discovery Tour as a teaching tool? So removing from the game an aspect of the game. This article from last year talks about this, about whether it is functional, and their conclusion is that it's nearly as effective at educating grade and high school students about ancient Egypt as a teacher, which is alarming, and that it can be so easily made redundant by a bit of Ubisoft programming. But there is a number of quite serious caveats, which the article states. The sample size is small, about 30 students per test case, basic topics that they tested them on, and they tested them immediately after playing the game. So it's not really testing knowledge acquisition. But even just by testing before and then after the game, students without any teacher guidance showed a 44% improvement in their base knowledge. 51% if teacher-led, so we're not completely redundant yet. 7% difference, it's important. And the most important takeaway that they got, this is also in Canada, so it's Ubisoft Canada that developed Assassin's Creed Origins, is that the Discovery Tour add-on and the research that about the project is worth doing. Which is interesting. It's like, okay, the initial thoughts like this is a useful teaching aid, can we use it? One of the academic people now, consultants, that's the word, involved in this, Jose Galan from the Spanish National Research Council, was interviewed about his involvement in PC Games N. And there's so much to unpack. This is just an example of what he wrote. And for me, every time I read this, it seems to be this real internal struggle between wanting to be really academic and pedagogically sound versus almost like tricking young people into learning stuff one way or the other. And so this recognition that maybe, how does he, I don't know how, I think he just refers to young people or youths elsewhere in the article as almost tricking them into learning stuff and recognizing that they access things in a different way. They're not as book driven, and maybe we need to appeal to them, make things more attractive for this generation to gain knowledge on different topics. And fighting with this inherent, well, not contradiction as such, between wanting things then to be accurate, but also then recognizing that the game is fiction. It is a work of fiction. It's fictional history based in a real place with real historical events, but ultimately it's a game by a AAA game developer made to shift units. And what's really interesting, he talks about this issue of academics having issues with presentation of Egypt in this way. And this statement, I think, is really important. We have to understand that the image we have of ancient Egypt might be as wrong as the one portrayed in video games. So straight away, we've got, this is a fictional Egypt, it's wrong in many respects from our perspective, but how we understand ancient Egypt may be wrong anyway. How are we reconstructing it? So kind of this really complicated relationship between accuracy and representation. We're not sure 100% what happened. Scientists and academic people should be more humble. I would add we should be less precious as well. And this idea of gatekeeping history and knowledge in different sectors as what we do, and we are the holders and protectors of that knowledge. And in fact, this is for everyone and people can represent it in different ways. Anything is welcome, even the most idiotic movies, Marvel kind of things, should be welcome. So again, it's this kind of undermining immediately the medium through which he's talking about. And fiction's important because you get a situation such as in the top right, where you get a crossover with Final Fantasy 15, it went both ways, which means you can ride a chocobo camel through the Egyptian desert. You know, this is a ferry, for those who haven't played Final Fantasy 15 either, it's like a giant ostrich, but better. And so, yeah, it's a fictional element. And so, wait, before I do the spoiler. And so we have this, and he's talking about Discovery Tour, right? We've got Discovery Tour. It's good. We can trick young people into learning stuff about Egypt, shows an increase in knowledge. But the article I mentioned before, this was the ultimate payout. The students also admitted they'd be unlikely to try Discovery Tour at home. Instead, they'd likely just play the regular game. Discovery Tour is not exciting. I was going to say fun, that's a different thing. You know, it's not a game you have to kind of be the type of gamer that likes exploring and just seeing a place and the interactive nature of it. And so some of the things I've been thinking about, one, is Discovery Tour enough as a standalone? And if you don't want to play Discovery Tour in maybe a school setting to learn, can you learn anything about the game or about Egypt just by playing the regular game? So a couple of thoughts. I'm not going to discuss all of them today, but kind of where I'm at. Can Assassin's Creed Origins be used for teaching? And if so, which part of it? Is it Discovery Tour? And if it's Discovery Tour, what are the advantages and disadvantages of the tour over the main game? For example, you miss the kind of cinematic historical interludes that contextualize everything as well. Something that Discovery Tour doesn't have that the main game has is when you are exploring, you get these blue triangles at times, which are pop-ups, and they're translations of text, which of course my dad reads and bemoans me for not reading them. And I'm like, what happened here? Did you not read all of the text, Jenny? No, I don't, because I'm already 80 hours deep in this game and I don't want to read everything. But some of the pop-ups that come up in the actual game, not Discovery Tour, the actual game, as far as I can tell through reading some of them, seem to be actual translations of ancient texts. So this is embedded without making a big song and dance out of it. And there's hundreds of these when you go around the game. So it's something that's in the main game that's not in Discovery Tour. How successful is Origins ACO in creating an immersive experience? And tied to that, how accurate is its creation of Egypt? If we're going to use it as a teaching tool, how well does it recreate the place and the history that it's discussing or presenting? Now, Historical video games and teaching, this is nothing new. I'm not radicalizing discipline here by saying we can use this. On the right is part of the conclusion of an article from a few years ago looking at mainly medieval games, largely strategy-based rather than action RPG, which students played a bit and then wrote like 500 words about their experience and reflecting on the experience, showing that this kind of supportive tool increased students' learning in the topic by making them active participants and not passive readers. So again, like, can you immerse someone in this world, get them involved in history or see it from a different perspective that can actually be used as part of this mixed learning, flipped classroom idea. And the flipped classroom idea lies at the heart of this EU project going on now, Flip2G, across various parts of Europe. And part of it, there's not just university, Revheim School in Stavanger, Norway, has introduced this article with the headline, Revheim School focuses on gaming, and this is in the Kommune, the local council website. Can gaming be used to teach students history and social sciences? Revheim School will find out when they are betting hard with their own game teacher and the country's first school gaming room. So high school in southern Norway introducing this and using Assassin's Creed as part of it. I've got no idea how that's going on. It's a high school, they don't have the great website of these research projects, but it'd be interesting to follow this up to see its actual implementation. And so, yeah, the back of my mind constantly is, can this be used? Is discovery taught easier in some respects, or generally just playing the game, can you learn? And so in terms of this accuracy, and this accuracy is a difficult word because it's ultimately a fictionalized Egypt. It's not a claim to be a National Geographic documentary, but how good is it recreating life? So most of the images in my capture gallery, so you largely see the things that I'm interested in the game, such as large papyrus plants on the edge of lakes. But when we get down to it and really nitty gritty, not just historical events, but just recreation of the landscape, reconstructing houses, bottom left, a screenshot, not mine this time from Google, but of one of the villages in the game. And if you remember from the discovery tour, it shows a image of a clay house. This is not the one they showed. This is from down the road at Manchester Museum. But the house that they're using as a model is actually a misrepresentation in many respects. These houses, clay houses that we have, commonly called soul houses, are from funerary contexts. They're placed on top of graves, tombs, and people go and leave offerings there. And it's not certain how representative they are of actual houses in villages in Egypt. One of the big issues of reconstructing houses in Egypt is they're made of mud brick on the floodplain largely, the non-surviving, also continuing occupation. Villages continued to be on those spaces and rebuilt over time. So we're not sure whether it looked like this. Plus, these soul houses are about 1,500 years before the chronological setting of the game. So how much can we do it? When I see the villages in Assassin's Creed, what I actually think of is in the top right here, Kazadakla is a village which continued to be occupied until the early modern period, originally being a Roman fort from the 2nd century, showing habitation soon afterwards. So it's actually only a couple hundred years as a start point after Cleopatra until about the 19th century. It continued to be occupied. And you see this mass jumble of mud brick houses, which was lucky enough to be there in 2010, which feels one that you're going through history, but also kind of the chaos of how it's recreated in Assassin's Creed is, and also these pigeon posts which are everywhere in Assassin's Creed for those who've played, well, for us who've played. And you can see this in some, looking at archaeological remains from a site Kuranis in the Fayum. The Fayum is one of the core centers of this semi-oasis southwest of Cairo. Black and white photos from the earlier 20th century, more recent ones showing the kind of houses that remain. But one of the hardest points with archaeology, especially with engaging non-archaeologists, is that it's a mess. It's really difficult to say, no, look, these are houses, it'll be 2-story, da-da-da-da. You know, you need this level of either having enough comparative material to know what you're looking at, or to imagine it. And I think Assassin's Creed does this great job of kind of visualizing in 3 dimensions and able you to traverse what is actually very hard to get across to, especially younger students, a reality of domestic life. And for most Egyptians, life is very rural, I've put like mundane but necessary activities. And the developers of Assassin's Creed have taken, I think, great pains to really reflect a lot of actual life in the Nile Valley. So just a couple of examples. One here is oxen treading grain, bottom right from Assassin's Creed, round in a circle, a man behind the ox to make sure it doesn't stop, and a person at the side to throw more wheat back in to be tread. On the left, comparative material. The top is from the early 19th century description of Egypt, which was put together by the scientific mission that accompanied Napoleon's expedition in Egypt, which documented both ancient and contemporary life in the Nile Valley at the time. Yeah, a few things have been modernized by 19th century standards, but the principle remains the same. The bottom is 14th century BC tomb scene, showing, in essence, apart from the fact there's more cows, exactly the same practice that we see in the game. Like, it's actually a very accurate representation of very standard rural activity that's been recreated in the game. Another thing that's been recreated is the effects of the natural landscape of Egypt. Egypt being dominated by the Nile. The Nile in antiquity, in fact, until the early 20th century, flooded annually for 3-4 months of the year. Otherwise, you require a lot of artificial irrigation, especially for land higher up. These are photos from 1930 and 1960, showing the quintessential water lifting device, the shadoof, an arm weighted on one end on a pole, which simply goes up and down when it's pulled down, as we see the figures here. On the right, there are so many shadoofs in Assassin's Creed that they've been skinned and then they've been just plopped throughout the game. They are modified with 2 posts. You do see them stacked, you see channels. So we have very few examples from ancient Egypt. Here's one, showing that it hasn't really changed much in time. But you have this, even if people then playing it don't realize what it is, and you cannot but come across them. They litter the game. As there's other realities of the game, as I mentioned, the Nile used to flood every year until the high dam was built at Aswan, which stopped the flooding and regulated the flow of the Nile. But beforehand, every year when the Nile flooded, you had the waters rise to the extent that on the left, you can see boats going between the columns of ancient temples. You can see this in some films before the 1950-ish, when they were doing it. This is a part of Egypt we will never now see again, because the Nile doesn't flood. But Assassin's Creed has floods, with colossi seated statues of Pharaoh and the boats going between. So whether they've not thought in seasonal terms, it happens throughout the game, but we get this glimpse, which is not just kind of a romanticized knowledge or vision, but would actually have been reality. This is how the landscape would have looked at a given point in the year. However, not everything in Assassin's Creed is that accurate. Ultimately, the Egyptian desert is quite flat, especially, there are a few areas that are mountainous, but here we have an image of the Giza Plateau at Saqqara with mountains at the back. For those who've never played Assassin's Creed before, one of the most important parts is parkour. You have to be able to climb up things and jump off things. in a very flat desert, apart from the bits where you hallucinate, which are quite cool, but in a very flat desert, there's nothing. You're just going on and on and on. They need caves to find stuff, to fight bandits, to fight animals, to craft, to kill, to craft. It's an RPG. You need the essentials of this kind of game to facilitate the game mechanics and not bore the players to death. So there is modification of the landscape to facilitate this. So we see this mountain range behind the pyramids, whereas the pyramids, it's a plateau. From the other perspective, today you've got Giza village, or Giza town. It's very densely populated up to the pyramids now. So yes, there are liberties. So again, I think in terms of learning, this is a fictionalized landscape as well in elements, but given an awareness that this is the case, as long as you don't come out and go to the pyramids and be really disappointed, there's no whacking great big mountain range behind it. But going from the pyramids, looking at the monumental landscape. And so, as I said, we've got the pyramids on the top left. You've got Bayek on top of, I think it should be the third pyramid, Menkares, looking down, looking across at the mountain range. But at the bottom right is a ruined blank temple. Assassin's Creed Origins makes no attempt to make everything pretty and new. There is a recognition within the game that the pyramids were ancient at the time of Cleopatra. It's increasingly a cliche, but Cleopatra is closer in us to time than she was to the pyramids. And so we don't get this complete flattening. We don't get this complete flattening out of archaeology, of history. We get this recognition that Egypt in the mid-1st century BC was still a really old country. And so we have these ruins and we have repurposing of sites. So we do see a multi-use of sites being windswept, abandoned. Windswept sand is always a problem. But we also get these great monumental constructions. So here, Temple of God Ptah at Memphis. Bright, colourful, fantastic, like really beautiful images. They're not necessarily accurate in some respects. So for example, when you go inside the temples, they're always really busy spaces, almost look much more like banqueting halls and party places than restricted access places, sanctuaries for the god, which would have had a wall around them and restricted access. They're very open. Most of them are garrisons as well by this point in the game, so you fight people. So it is a modification of the function of this space. In the top left, we have 4 priests sat at a table reading scrolls, writing, I think, as well, and just in the side, for lack of anachronisms, bookcase with the scrolls in them. And this is an entirely anachronistic image of sat down at a desk, beautifully carved, nice, maybe Elizabethan Victorian style. But temples were centers of knowledge. Priests were the most literate people in Egyptian society. This is where records were held, where literary works were written, copied, translated. They are repositories of knowledge, both priests and temples. So this, as an image of that aspect of Egyptian life, is correct. How it's manifested is much more kind of maybe what was assumed to a modern audience, or thinking more of like Umberto Eco, Name of the Rose, kind of monasteries later being these scriptoria, which is also kind of an analogy that's sometimes anachronistically imposed on temples as well. But for me, like the most spectacular thing, like you see these great temples with color, and this recoloring the ancient world may seem obvious, like, yeah, it's a temple, it's got color, but it's really not. Like, we have this great whitening of ancient antiquity. Marble statues, you go to galleries, clean lines, nice limestone, but the ancient world, not just Egypt, was an incredibly gaudy, bright place. So on the left, we have a screenshot from the game. On the right is the temple of Ramesses III, Medinet Habu, mid-12th century BC, where some of the colour still survives, and we get a hint, well, more than hints, suggestions of these really vivid primary colours that the dry conditions of Egypt do preserve. So the colour for the temples in Assassin's Creed is not fiction. It's not something to make a more colourful palette. This is how Egyptian areas would have looked. This is like, for example, it's a big work on producing these coloured recreations in digital epigraphy. Won't go into this, but again, this colour palette, and we can see also how colour palettes changed over centuries. Again, it's like really long period of time. And as I said, there's an increasing move to recolour the past, which is really confronting when you go into some galleries and you've been kind of indoctrinated the Greek Roman statuary. It's very sober, it's white, it's clean. It appeals to a Victorian aesthetic that they can incorporate back in Britain when they're rampaging and taking everything from everywhere. So a couple of examples. Top right, this is on in the gallery in the Glyptothek in Copenhagen, plus recolored Caligula's head with kind of like ruddy, like it's really, you see it and it's jarring because you're not used to it. But this isn't just creating it, this is through polychromatic analysis of traces of paint on the objects. And again, heads, so you see them, they kind of become nice and graceful to, you know, we're not used to it. It's very jarring, but this is the reality. And there's this big move, well, some people still kind of don't accept that the world would be as colourful. But there's a number of ancient historians and archaeologists really promoting this, trying to change our image of the world. And Assassin's Creed, it's just there. No one questions it in the game. This is a video I took from an exhibition in London beginning of the year from Mesopotamia, IMS Shobanapalm. And what they've done with this and one other piece is rather than plaster cast it and paint it, they've projected light specifically onto it to show it as it would originally have looked. I didn't carry on the video to stay because then they kind of made it in blotches disappear as well. So you stood there once and a woman came round and said, I thought I was losing my mind because it was blank when I walked past here before, and now it's colour, until she stood with me taking the video and then saw it kind of appearing and disappearing. But this appreciation of the world as a colourful place, as opposed to Expedia, the travel company, produced this GIF, however it is, of Luxor Temple, obviously to promote tours to Egypt, to Luxor. And yes, they do this impressive job of kind of three-dimensionally recreating a lot of the bits and pieces, but they don't add on the colour. One, that would have been a hell of a lot bigger job. I appreciate that, but still, you know, this difference in this assumption that ancient stuff is white, whereas ancient stuff isn't. And for me, Assassin's Creed really does that, and it contributes to this immersive experience. And this is a few points now just to go into in this. Can Assassin's Creed fill a hole that we have in terms of Egyptology in this creation of a digital world to explore, and from my perspective, bring Egypt to not just our students, but I work in Key Stage 2 in primary school with those students, also outreach more broadly, Manchester Centre for Youth Studies, as this can be used in the community more broadly. I would love to take my students to Egypt. It's not cheap, and my head of department won't let me. So, because there is this constant institutional fear every time you hear about something happening in Egypt that it's not safe, we're not taking anyone. Okay, institutional concerns are there. If we can't afford or can't afford in kind of a whole array of meanings to take students out, can we bring Egypt to them? And what else is out there that we can use as a teaching tool? In the background, this is actually the Valley of the Kings from the DLC, the downloadable content, which I won't be talking about today, but also does this really great and different job. It is actually then a valley and a more mountainous place. So these mountains are legit. And so what is out there? First of all, as a contrast, Rome and ancient historians working on Rome really spank Egyptologists at this point. Matthew Nichols from University of Reading has produced over 10 years this virtual Rome. So this isn't a photo of Rome, this is the model that he created initially just as a teaching aid and to put pictures into PowerPoints, which he has since licensed out to various companies and BBC to kind of produce this sweeping, they've modified it, but you can, and he said in talks with various people, explore Rome, ancient Rome, through his reconstruction. And you can also do a free online MOOC through Reading that is a virtual tour of this setup. We have nothing like this for Egypt. Even Google Earth, we can't access sites. Last month, whenever it was, when Tom did his games and VR setup, he put up Google VR as one point, and with the headset and peripherals, and it looks at Manhattan, fantastic, Rio de Janeiro and Christ the Redeemer, wonderful. Get to Egypt, no. You cannot zoom in. For a long time, Egypt's had these restrictions on what you can see on Google Earth, and that translates into VR as well for security purposes. So this is an example of kind of the best that you can get. Pyramids, you know what the pyramids are, but you can see how the photogrammetry, kind of all different photos mapping together to form images, the texture changes a lot between what they have added in and what they allow you to see. This is a temple from Medinet Habu that I showed with the colour, and the front pylons seem to have had lots of composites or photogrammetry build-up, but it really stands out awkwardly compared to the rest. Luxor Temple, one of the most important Avenue of Sphinxes, this is the best resolution you can get. Similarly, Del Bakri, one major tourist site, also this, no, I won't go into other more bad things that happened, but major site, and I know when I'm going around Google Earth or VR what sites are where, because I have a pretty decent grasp of the geography and archaeology of various sites. But if you don't, it's not usable to be able to find and identify one place from another. So that's out. Increasingly, we have the use of different VR technologies in the big scope of digital humanities being used within Egyptology. We're a bit slower on the take-up than other archaeological disciplines. This is a site excavated by the British Museum, Amara West, which, as well as having a PDF you can download plus standard kind of archaeological representations, has a link to Sketchfab, which is open to use in these three-dimensional models. I was interested, hoping that you could use Google Cardboard or other mobile VR sets to do this, but the resolution is too high to translate down to mobile, so you can't see it in this site. And even single objects in that, you see it and you move and it's gone, you can't rotate it, you can't walk around it. Like, it's limited capacity. And also, more importantly, I know that this is online because I went to a conference that they spoke about it. How many people have access or just stumble upon it through sheer luck or perseverance? Another site, describing Egypt.com, has scanned and done VR representations, well, three-dimensional representations of a number of sites, archaeological sites in Egypt, a number of New Kingdom tombs, 2 Old Kingdom tombs, and a couple of later temples. And when you go in, on one hand, you can just on the computer scan around and see the images in really good resolution for a lot of it. But you've also got the opportunity to use it on your phone as mobile phone. But again, the resolution, you can still do it. The resolution drops. But again, while you can turn and see what's immediately around you, you can't move within that environment. Like mobile headsets yet haven't built in that device, even to look at a point that can maybe then take you somewhere else and to look, which is something that myself and my colleague in history, Ben Edwards, wanted to look into and see if you can do. But until then, we don't have this functionality. And so when we look at Egypt and VR that's available now, and so there was, I would be remiss if I didn't say there was a conference in November about digital humanities and Egyptology. And a lot of it is still tools that we can use in research to help visualize and record and preserve monuments digitally. Only 2 of the papers over the 3 days were about digital humanities and teaching, and 1 museum objects and 1 more site-based. So we're still lagging a lot behind some other disciplines for it. And so when we look at how we create immersive environments for teaching for our students, or any students, we have limited options. Google Earth isn't functional. Sketchfab is fine just on screen and rotating images, but you can't 3D them. Describing Egypt.com, I think, is a great initiative with potential, but obviously it's also, I don't know what access or how they, if it's just one mission and what they have rights to, and also the resolution goes. And so for teaching, even if it was better, you need a classroom with all the students with smartphones, Google Cardboard sets or the equivalent, and one-on-one basis. So how also kind of immersive in terms of teaching purposes is it just to kind of turn a bunch into zombies looking around, how can we engage? And instead, can Assassin's Creed in the classroom setting, maybe with Discovery Tour, be used instead to replicate to a degree this kind of immersive experience when we don't have something else that does this? And as I've shown with just a couple of examples, there is a close attention to detail. I think especially if you can engage with students, like what do you think is accurate, and have them engage either with other museum, with artifacts or archaeological records, and get them engaged in this more active participants and looking in and seeing how reconstruction is done. Can we use it for that? There's a lot of incidental detail. Also, one thing I didn't talk about is the creation of a multicultural world. You have the Egyptians, the Ptolemies of Greek or Macedonian descent ruling the country. It's also a time when the Romans are getting a bigger grip on Egypt as well. It's a decade or so before the Roman conquest. You have, if you walk around Alexandria, you hear non-player characters, NPCs, speaking Greek. You hear, when you get to garrisons, Roman soldiers speaking Latin. Most Egyptian characters speak accented English. There has been comments that like Cleopatra speaks unaccented English, whereas Egyptians are accented English, and this kind of colonialism or just differentiating. I think it's a difficult point to deal with. But a lot of the Egyptians, like there's phrases of ancient Egyptian going in. If you bump into someone, they'll scream Neteru, gods. You know, there's kind of this, so you have this audio-visual world that you can run through. And so then the point, like, can it be used for teaching? If so, how? I think Discovery Tour on laptops can help engage and help students be active participants in discovering Egypt, or using it as a stepping out point to contextualize things, if nothing else, whether it's playing Discovery Tour or playing the actual game, either in a university context or if they do have their own kit. Sure that most of our students aren't going to have, well, I don't want to assume anything, but they're expensive pieces of kit. And is it useful here, or can we make functional, important use of it rather than, you know, passive acquisition of knowledge or passive information gaining? I just want to end on Metacritic comment from one user who gave it 10 stars, 10 out of 10. Tira, I'll openly admit I quite dislike the AC franchise. It's like I wrote this. I'm not a fan otherwise. I don't have the patience to play a lot of the Assassin's Creed Origins and slowly assassinate. Although saying that, I started playing The Witcher 3 again, and I'm really annoyed that I can't creep around and murder people in tents. So, you know, it comes and goes. However, I was fascinated by ancient Egypt ever since I was a child, so I decided to give Origins a try, and wow, it's much better than I imagined. And I couldn't agree. I'm not Tira, this isn't me, but I think this sums up a lot of excellent points. Like, one, cynically also from Ubisoft's point, can setting games in different areas that people have an interest in, one, brings them to the games, but also people who game, can it increase their interest in Egypt? Can it be a symbiotic relationship? it's not going to be equally, people aren't going to go equally between the two. But I think that there is lots of interesting things to be said about the game and lots of interesting applications for the game, whether within immediately man-met, but also rolling it out to other people. And actually my very last slide, away from the Sphinx, with its colour and nose, before the nose was battered off. For those interested, I just want to flag up Andrew Reinhardt and his book from last year, Archaeo Gaming, which I will be writing a review of for the Manchester Game Studies Network website. But as this multi-layered understanding for Archaeo Gaming is, which has really been gaining ground in the past few years, from, and this is a plug for a book that's not even mine, but I think it's awesome for anyone interested, going from, he was involved in the excavation in 2014 of the Atari dump site in New Mexico, so literally archaeology of games, but also whether you are playing an archaeologist in a game, whether it's Lara Croft, Indiana Jones, new game Heaven's Vault, or if you are doing archaeology within games, whether it's No Man's Sky or something else, in this huge range of application that I think is really promising. I think we can situate Assassin's Creed Origins within that as well. And I will end there. Thank you.